Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into the nuts and bolts of the regulations that every aviation maintenance technician needs to know cold. We're talking about the core documents that define your responsibilities and keep aircraft flying safely.
That's right. Think of this as your guide to the regulatory maze, especially for those of you in AMT general studies. Understanding this structure isn't just about passing tests, it's about your future career, your license, and ultimately, flight safety. We're aiming for clarity and practical application here.
Exactly. Forget just memorizing part numbers. We want you to see how these rules connect and why they matter every single time you sign off on maintenance. So, let's start at the top. The Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR, specifically Title 14.
Title 14, Aeronautics and Space. This is the home base for basically all modern FAA regulations. It's a system that's been built up over time, really since the Air Commerce Act, way back in 1926. It's got quite a history.
And that history leads to a really important point about terminology right off the bat, doesn't it? The whole FARs versus CFR thing.
Oh, definitely. You'll still hear veteran mechanics talk about FARs, meaning Federal Aviation Regulations. And look, that's what they were called for a long time. But the problem is FARs also stands for something else entirely in government rules.
Title 48, right, the Federal Acquisitions Regulations.
Precisely. Two completely different sets of rules, same acronym, caused a lot of confusion. So the FAA made a deliberate shift.
They get more specific.
Exactly. They now officially use 14 CFR Part, whatever the number is.
Right.
So 14 CFR Part 43, 14 CFR Part 91. It points you directly to Title 14 Aeronautics and Space. No ambiguity.
And that's not just bureaucratic nitpicking, is it? When you're documenting your work, using the correct reference is critical.
Absolutely critical. In logbook entries on FAA Form 337s, you need that precise 14 CFR Part XX designation. It matters for compliance and liability.
Okay, so Title 14 is huge. You mentioned it's broken down into volumes.
Yeah, 5 volumes. The first 3 contain the bulk of the regulations. The FAA administers something like 75 active regulations. This is a massive body of rules.
But there's a structure to it, a way to mentally organize those 75 parts.
So is. They generally fall into 3 main categories, which kind of gives you a map of the FAA's responsibilities.
Okay, what are they?
First, you've got administrative rules. That's the FAA regulating itself, its internal procedures, stuff like that.
Got it. Internal workings.
Second is airworthiness certification. This is all about the design and manufacturing side, getting aircraft and parts approved in the first place. Think parts 21 up through 35, the design standards.
Right, the blueprints and initial approvals.
And third, and this is really our focus today, is airworthiness operation. This covers how aircraft are actually used, maintained, and kept airworthy out in the field. That's where parts 43 and 91 come in the heart of maintenance rules.
Now, something interesting about the numbering within those parts. I've noticed a lot of the key regulations are odd numbered. Part 21, 23, 25, 43, 91. Is there a reason for that?
That's actually a fascinating bit of regulatory history and foresight. When the FAA recodified the old civil air regulations, the CARs, back in 1958, they intentionally used odd numbers for the foundational rules.
Why? To leave gaps.
Exactly. They knew aviation technology and regulations would evolve. They left the even numbers open deliberately, giving them space to insert new rules, new subparts, or amendments later on without having to completely renumber the entire system. It allowed for growth.
That's quite clever, actually, planning for the future like that.
It really was. So generally, if you see an odd-numbered part, it's often one of the original foundational rules.
Okay, but sometimes situations pop up that don't fit neatly into that structure or need a quick, specific fix. That's where SFRs come in, Special Federal Aviation Regulations.
Correct. SFRs are like temporary patches or focused rules for unique circumstances. They're not part of the main numbered structure in the same way.
And they're usually time-limited.
Often, yes. They address a specific issue, maybe for a particular group of people or a certain type of operation, and might have an expiration date. Their numbering is just sequential. SFR 100, SFR 101 It doesn't directly link to the CFR part they might be affecting.
The example given was SFR 100 to 2.
Yeah, that one provided some relief on certificate duration and currency requirements for military and civilian personnel who were deployed overseas during certain conflicts. Very specific situation, specific group, temporary need.
Makes sense. Now, as an AMT, you're not just dealing with books of rules. You have to interact with the FAA itself. Who are the main points of contact for a mechanic?
Your primary interaction, day-to-day, is going to be with the Flight Standards Service, known as AFS, and specifically your local Flight Standards District Office, the FSDO.
The FSDO, that's like the local FAA field office?
Pretty much, yeah. They're the boots on the ground for the FAA concerning operations and maintenance. They handle oversight of mechanics and repair stations. They issue inspection authorizations, IAs. They might approve certain maintenance programs. And they conduct surveillance to make sure everyone's following the rules,
Mhm.
especially Parts 91 and 43.
So, for recurrent airworthiness, the FSDO is key.
Absolutely. They're your main regulatory point of contact for maintenance activities.
Is there another part of the FAA we might encounter?
You might, though probably less often as a line mechanic. That's the Aircraft Certification Service, or AIR.
And their focus is different.
Completely. AR deals with the original airworthiness side of things. They're the ones approving the actual designs, issuing type certificates for new aircraft models, supplemental type certificates for major modifications, that sort of thing.
So, unless you're working for a manufacturer or heavily involved in designing major alterations.
You probably won't interact directly with AR very much. Your go-to is usually the FSDO for anything related to maintenance approval or oversight.
Okay, that sets the scene, the regulatory landscape. Now, let's dive into the concept that underpins everything we do as mechanics. Airworthiness. It sounds straightforward, but its formal definition is actually kind of new in the regulations.
It really is the cornerstone, isn't it? The whole point of all these rules. And you're right, for decades, the definition was more implied than explicitly stated in the regulations.
You get to piece it together.
Yeah, you'd look at Part 21, Section 21.183, dealing with issuing airworthiness certificates and various FAA guidance documents. But there wasn't one single sentence saying airworthy means X and Y,
Until recently.
until they added 14 CFR Part 3, specifically Section 3.5. Now, we have a clear, legally codified definition. It provides much-needed certainty.
So, what is that official definition? What two things must be true for an aircraft to be considered airworthy?
It boils down to two fundamental requirements that have to be met simultaneously. First, the aircraft must conform to its type design.
Meaning it matches the official blueprint.
Exactly. It matches the specifications laid out in its Type Certificate Data Sheet, TCDS, plus any properly approved alterations, like those done via an STC or FAA Form 337. It has to be built and configured as approved.
Okay, conformity is pillar one. What's pillar two?
Pillar 2 is the aircraft must be in a condition for safe operation. This is about the physical state of the aircraft, wear and tear, damage, proper functioning of systems.
Let's make that practical. Say I install a fancy new gadget, but I didn't get the required STC for it. The gadget works perfectly, maybe even improves safety, but...
But you violated Pillar 1. The aircraft no longer conforms to its approved type design because that gadget isn't part of the approved configuration. It's unairworthy, purely on a conformity basis, even if it seems safe to fly.
Okay. Flip side. Everything matches the TCDS perfectly, all the installed parts are correct, but the brakes are worn beyond limits and there's a major fuel leak.
Now you violated Pillar 2. The aircraft conforms to its design, but it's clearly not in a condition for safe operation. Still unairworthy.
So as the mechanic signing off, you're certifying both.
That's precisely what your signature means. You are legally attesting that the aircraft conforms to its type design and is in a condition for safe operation. It's a huge responsibility. The pilot does a pre-flight check focusing mostly on condition. The mechanic's job involves verifying condition and that deeper historical conformity.
That distinction naturally leads to the idea of original versus recurrent airworthiness.
Right. Airworthiness has two phases. Original airworthiness is about getting the aircraft certified in the first place, the design, the manufacturing, meeting those initial standards. Recurrent airworthiness is everything that happens after that, keeping it airworthy through maintenance and operation throughout its life.
And for us focusing on maintenance, that recurrent side is governed by what you call the Big Three regulations.
That's how I like to think of them, yeah. Almost everything we do in maintenance ties back to these three core parts.
Okay, lay them out for us.
First, 14 CFR Part 21, Certification Procedures for Products and Parts. While it's heavily involved in original airworthiness, it defines what the approved aircraft and parts are supposed to look like, the type design data.
Got it. Part 21 defines the standard.
Second, 14 CFR Part 43, Maintenance, Preventive Maintenance, Rebuilding, and Alterations. This is how the rules for actually performing the work legally, who can do it, and how it needs to be documented.
The mechanics rulebook.
Pretty much. And third, 14 CFR Part 91, General Operating and Flight Rules. This provides the operational context and, crucially, assigns the who is ultimately responsible for maintaining the aircraft's airworthiness. Hint, it's the owner-operator.
Part 21. What? Part 43, how? Part 91, who's responsible? That's a great framework.
It helps connect the dots. You can see how an action under Part 43 needs to ensure conformity defined by Part 21 to meet the responsibility assigned by Part 91.
Excellent. Okay, with that foundation, let's dig deeper into original airworthiness first. That means starting with Part 21 in more detail. You said it's the gateway to certification.
It really is. Part 21 lays out all the requirements for getting the key approvals from the FAA. Things like the Type Certificate, TC, that's the master approval for a specific aircraft, engine, or propeller design.
The birth certificate, basically.
Kind of, yeah. It also covers Supplemental Type Certificates, STCs, which are approvals for making changes to that original TC design. Think modifying an aircraft with different avionics or winglets.
And production certificates.
Right, that allows manufacturers to actually produce copies of the type certificated product.
Yeah.
And ultimately, Part 21 governs how the actual physical airworthiness certificates get issued for individual aircraft.
But you mentioned Part 21 isn't just about the big picture design approvals. It affects mechanics sourcing parts, too.
Yes, absolutely. Part 21 also details the procedures for getting approval to manufacture replacement parts. This happens through two main routes: parts manufacturer approval, PMA, or producing parts under a technical standard order, TSO, authorization.
PMA and TSO parts, we see those markings.
You do. FAA PMA, or FAA TSO, marked on a part, tells you it's gone through an approval process under Part 21 and is considered legally eligible for installation on specific aircraft models. Using approved parts is fundamental to maintaining conformity, that first pillar of airworthiness.
Now, within Part 21, there's a section critical for ongoing maintenance, especially after modifications. Section 21.50, instructions for continued airworthiness, the ICAs.
Hugely important. ICAs are the maintenance instructions that the manufacturer or STC holder must provide. They tell the mechanic what needs to be done to keep that specific product or modification airworthy over its life.
And this is especially key for STCs.
Yes, particularly for STCs approved after 1981. The rule mandates that these STCs must come with a complete set of ICAs. It's not optional.
Yeah.
If you install that STC, you now have new mandatory maintenance requirements defined in its ICA.
And these ICAs aren't just vague suggestions. They have required content, right? Like those 16 specific subjects mentioned.
They do. They have to be comprehensive. Some of the absolute must-know items for a mechanic within those ICAs include, well, first and foremost, the Airworthiness Limitations section, ALS.
The ALS, what's critical there?
This section lists mandatory replacement times for life-limited parts or mandatory inspection intervals or procedures. These are non-negotiables. You cannot deviate from the ALS without specific FAA approval. It's legally binding.
So check the ALS first. What else is vital in the ICA?
You'll find the recommended inspection programs, the schedule and scope of inspections needed. Detailed servicing information, things like where access panels are, jacking points, lubricant types, fluid specs, torque values. Also, information on control and operation, which tells you how to test and adjust systems after maintenance.
So installing an STC isn't just about the physical work. You inherit a whole new set of mandatory maintenance tasks defined by its ICA.
That's exactly right. The ICA connects the initial design approval directly to your ongoing maintenance plan. You have to check it and incorporate its requirements.
Okay. Part 21 links to the design standards themselves. For airplanes, the big split is Part 23 versus Part 25.
Right. Think of Part 23 as covering most of what we call general aviation. It applies to normal, utility, acrobatic, and commuter category airplanes. The standard cutoff is a maximum takeoff weight of 12,500 pounds or less.
So trainers, most single-engine pistons, light twins, even some smaller turboprops.
Correct.
Yeah.
Although there's a subcategory within Part 23, the commuter category, which allows for planes up to 19,000 pounds and typically up to 19 passenger seats. But generally, Part 23 is for smaller aircraft.
And Part 25.
Part 25 is for transport category airplanes. These are the big guys, typically commercial airliners, large corporate jets. Defined as aircraft with a max takeoff weight over 12,500 pounds, or turbojets regardless of weight. The design standards in Part 25 are significantly more stringent than Part 23, reflecting the scale and complexity of these operations.
Different weight classes, different safety standards.
Essentially, yes. Both parts cover similar areas like flight, structures, power plant, equipment, but the specific requirements within those areas are much tougher for Part 25.
And we see a similar split for helicopters.
We do, with Parts 27 to 29. Part 27 is for normal category rotorcraft. The limits there are generally 7,000 pounds maximum weight and 9 or fewer passenger seats, your typical smaller helicopters.
And Part 29.
Part 29 is transport category rotorcraft. These are helicopters over 7,000 pounds. Part 29 has much more demanding requirements, especially around performance and system redundancy, often scaling with weight and passenger capacity, potentially up to 20,000 pounds.
Can't forget engines and props either. They get their own certifications.
Absolutely. Part 33 covers aircraft engines, both piston and turbine. Part 35 covers propellers. They have to be type certificated, just like the airframe. Part 33 is particularly interesting because it mandates really rigorous testing, including those demanding block tests.
Block test.
Yeah, where the engine has to run continuously for extended periods under various simulated flight conditions, takeoff power, climb, cruise, etc., to prove its durability and reliability before it's approved. It's a crucial part of ensuring engine airworthiness from the start.
Okay, so aircraft generally have to meet the standards in place when they were built. But there's one FAA tool that can reach back and force changes on older designs for safety reasons. That's Part 39, Airworthiness Directives, or ADs.
ADs are critical. They are legally enforceable rules under Part 39. The FAA issues an AD when they find an unsafe condition in a product, an aircraft, engine, propeller, or appliance, and they determine the condition is likely to exist or develop in other products of the same type design.
It's a way to fix a fleet-wide problem.
Exactly. It could be due to a design flaw discovered later, a material failure, unexpected wear. If it's a safety issue affecting the whole design type, an AD is usually the response.
And compliance is absolutely mandatory. What happens if a mechanic signs off an aircraft when an applicable AD hasn't been complied with?
Big trouble. First, the aircraft is instantly unairworthy. Flying it is illegal under Part 91. Second, the mechanic who performed the last inspection or signed the return to service could face serious consequences, certificate action, suspension, even revocation, because they effectively certified an unsafe and non-compliant aircraft. Missing an AD is a cardinal sin in maintenance.
So where do we actually find the specific instructions for these ADs? They're not literally printed in Part 39 itself, are they?
No, Part 39 is the enabling regulation, the law that says ADs exist and must be followed. The actual AD notes, the instructions detailing the required action, the compliance time, and applicability are published as amendments to Section 39.13 in the Federal Register.
The Federal Register, that's the official government publication for rules.
Correct. That's where ADs gain their legal force. Mechanics need access to AD databases or services that track these publications.
And the FAA has different ways of issuing ADs depending on how urgent the safety issue is.
Yes, there are basically three paths. The standard one is a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, NPRM. The FAA proposes the AD, allows time for public comments, reviews them, and then issues a final rule. This is for less urgent issues where there's time for that process.
Okay, standard process. What if it's more urgent?
Then they might issue a final rule with a request for comments. This happens when the safety issue requires action faster than the full NPRM process allows, maybe in less than 60 days. The AD becomes effective immediately, but they still solicit comments after the fact.
And the third type is for immediate danger.
That's the emergency AD. This is reserved for truly critical safety issues that demand immediate action before further flight. Think major structural failure potential. These are sent out rapidly, often by fax or email or registered letter, directly to known owners and operators that constitutes actual notice.
But it still needs formal publication.
Yes. To make it legally binding on everyone, the emergency AD must be followed up quickly, usually within 30 days, by publication as a final rule AD in the Federal Register.
Got it. Okay, that covers the original certification side and ADs. Now let's pivot to the core of daily maintenance life. Recurrent airworthiness. This brings us squarely into Parts 43 and 91. Part 43 is really the AMT's handbook for doing work, right?
Absolutely. 14 CFR Part 43. Maintenance, preventive maintenance, rebuilding, and alteration. This defines how you work on certified aircraft in the U.S. It lays out the standards, the procedures, who's allowed to do what. It's inseparable from Part 91, which defines the responsibility.
So the very first thing Part 43 forces you to do is classify the work. Is it a repair or an alteration?
That's the fundamental starting point. You have to know what kind of work you're doing.
So give us the practical difference. What makes something a repair versus an alteration?
A repair is work that it essentially restores the aircraft or component back to its previous or properly altered condition. It fixes something that's broken or worn, bringing it back to the approved standard. Replacing a worn tire with the correct approved type of tire is a repair. Replacing a time-expired engine with the exact same model specified in the TCDS is a repair.
Okay, restoring to the approved state. What's an alteration then?
An alteration is any change that modifies the aircraft from its previous approved configuration. You're changing the design or function. Installing winglets that weren't original equipment is an alteration. Upgrading from steam gauges to a full glass cockpit is a major alteration.
Changing the blueprint, essentially.
Exactly. Repair restores the blueprint, alteration changes it.
Okay, once you know if it's a repair or alteration, the next critical step is deciding. Is it major or minor? Why is this distinction so important?
It's huge because it dictates the type of data you must use to do the work and the type of paperwork required to document it, which directly impacts liability.
So what defines a major action, either a major repair or a major alteration?
Part 1 defines it, but essentially a major action is one that, if done improperly, might appreciably affect the aircraft's airworthiness, its weight, balance, structural strengths, performance, power plant operation, flight characteristics. And importantly, it's work that's not done according to standard accepted practices or that can't be done by elementary operations.
So modifying a wing spar, definitely major.
Oh yeah. Repairing skin damage using standard riveting techniques might be minor, but splicing a primary structural member, that's major. Installing a completely new type of radio system, major alteration. Replacing a landing light bulb, minor repair.
And how does this major-minor classification affect the data we need?
This is key. For minor repairs and alterations, you need to use acceptable data. This is data that the FAA finds acceptable, but hasn't formally approved for a specific application.
Where do we find acceptable data?
Common sources are the manufacturer's maintenance manuals, non-mandatory service bulletins, SBs, or standard practice guides like the FAA's Advisory Circular AC 43.13-1 B2B. This AC is titled Acceptable Methods, Techniques, and Practices Aircraft Inspection and Repair Alteration. It's full of standard procedures for common tasks.
Okay, acceptable data for minor work. What about major work?
For major repairs and alterations, you absolutely must use approved data. This is data that the FAA has specifically reviewed and approved for that particular application.
And examples of approved data would be?
Airworthiness directives, ADs, are approved data. Supplemental type certificates, STCs, contain approved data. The aircraft's Type Certificate Data Sheet, TCDS, is approved data. Sometimes, a manufacturer service bulletin is specifically stamped by the FAA as approved. FAA Form 337 field approvals generate approved data for that specific aircraft.
So the source of the data is critical, and it depends entirely on whether the job is major or minor.
Correct, and liability follows. If you do a minor repair using acceptable data from AC 43.13 and something goes wrong, the focus might be on whether you applied the technique correctly. If you do a major alteration using STC data, your primary responsibility is ensuring you followed that approved data exactly.
You mentioned FAA Form 337 and field approvals. What if you need to do a major repair or alteration, maybe on an older plane, and there's just no existing STC or other pre-approved data available? How does a mechanic get approval then?
That's where the field approval process comes in, using FAA Form 3327. The mechanic or repair station develops the repair or alteration plan. They fill out the front of the Form 337, describing the aircraft and the work. Crucially, in Block 8 on the back, they must provide detailed substantiating data drawings, stress analysis, test results, maybe references to existing acceptable data that prove the modification meets FAA standards and is safe.
So you provide the technical justification.
Exactly. You gather all the technical evidence, then you submit this package, the partially completed 337, and all your supporting data to your local FSDO. An FAA Aviation Safety Inspector, ASI, usually one with maintenance expertise, reviews it all.
And if they agree, it's safe and compliant.
If they find your data convincing and the alteration meets the required airworthiness standards, the ASI will sign Block 3 of the Form 337, approval for return to service. That signature is the FAA approval for that specific major repair or alteration on that specific aircraft. It makes the data you provided approved data for that instance.
That sounds like a significant process.
It can be, especially ensuring your substantiating data is robust enough. But it's a vital pathway for maintaining and modifying aircraft, particularly older ones, when off-the-shelf approved data doesn't exist.
Okay. Part 43 also makes a distinction that often trips people up. Overhaul versus rebuild. Section 43.2 defines these. What's the key difference?
It's a really important difference, especially for tracking component history and time. An item is considered overhauled if it's been disassembled, cleaned, inspected, repaired as necessary, reassembled, and tested in accordance with approved standards set by the manufacturer or FAA. Critically, it's tested to meet service limits tolerances that allow for some wear but are still acceptable for continued operation.
So overhauled means it meets acceptable wear limits. How is rebuilt different?
Rebuilt is a much higher standard. A rebuilt item must be disassembled, cleaned, inspected, repaired, reassembled, and tested to the same tolerances and limits as a new item. It has to meet the new part specifications.
New part specs. That sounds like a big deal.
It is. And this difference is why, under Part 91.421, an engine that has been rebuilt by the manufacturer or an agency approved by the manufacturer can legally be given a zero-time record. It's considered equivalent to new in terms of its operating history clock. An overhauled engine, however, just continues its time in service.
So rebuilt potentially resets the clock to zero if done by the manufacturer. Overhauled does not. Huge difference for logbooks and value.
Absolutely. You need to understand that distinction when reviewing records or signing off work.
Now, who is actually allowed to perform all this maintenance, preventive maintenance, rebuilding, and alteration under Part 43? Section 43.3 lists them out.
Yeah, there are 9 categories of persons or entities authorized to do the work. The obvious ones are certificated mechanics, AMP, certificated repair stations, Part 145, and air carriers operating under their own continuous airworthiness maintenance programs, Parts 121, 135.
But there are some important exceptions or nuances AMT students should know, like pilots doing work.
Right. One key exception is for preventive maintenance. A certificated pilot, excluding sport pilots, is allowed to perform certain listed preventive maintenance tasks on an aircraft they own or operate, provided that aircraft isn't used in commercial service, like Part 121 or 135.
And what counts as preventive maintenance?
Part 43, Appendix A, Paragraph C, lists the specific tasks. It's things like changing oil, replacing spark plugs, servicing landing gear tires, replacing bulbs, simple stuff. The pilot has to log the work just like a mechanic would.
Okay, so pilots can do some basic upkeep on their own planes. Any other notable exceptions in 43.3?
There's one related to remote helicopter operations under Part 135. If a helicopter is operating in a remote area where certified mechanics aren't readily available, the pilot can be authorized by the operator and the FAA to perform certain maintenance tasks beyond just preventive maintenance, but they need specific training and authorization. It's a practical allowance for remote ops.
Makes sense. So the work gets done by an authorized person, but who can legally sign it off and approve the aircraft for return to service? RTS. That's Section 43.7.
Right. Performing the work and approving it for RTS are distinct authorities. Section 43.7 lists 7 categories of persons who could approve for RTS. This includes, importantly, an A&P mechanic holding an inspection authorization, IA, for annual inspections or major repairs alteration.
So not just any A&P can sign off an annual.
Correct. An A&P can perform a 100-hour inspection and sign the RTS, but only an A&P with an IA can sign off an annual inspection or approve major repairs alterations unless done under a repair station.
Yeah.
Properly rated repair stations, Part 145, can also approve RTS for work done under their certificate.
What about the certificated repairmen under Part 65? Can they approve for RTS?
That's a critical distinction and a common point of confusion. A Part 65 certificated repairman is authorized to perform specific maintenance tasks based on their certificate limitations, often tied to a particular repair station and job function. However, they are specifically not authorized to approve the aircraft, airframe, engine propeller, or appliance for return to service.
So they can do the work, but someone else with broader authority needs to sign the official RTS.
Generally, yes. The RTS signature requires the person signing to make the overall airworthiness determination, conformity, and safe condition. The repairman's certificate usually doesn't grant that broad authority. It's typically focused on performing specific tasks correctly. An A&P, IA, or repair station makes the final airworthiness call.
Okay, that's a vital detail. And that RTS signature isn't just a scribble. It requires a very specific maintenance record entry, right? Sections 43.9 and 43.11 cover this.
Absolutely. Every maintenance entry, whether it's for a repair, alteration, or inspection, has mandatory components. You need a description of the work performed. What did you actually do?
Be specific.
Very specific. Then the date the work was completed, the signature of the person approving the return to service, their certificate number, and the type of certificate they hold. For e.g., AMP, IA, repair station, hashtag.
5 key items for every entry.
Yes. And if it was a major repair or a major alteration, the entry must also include or reference the FAA Form 3307 that documents the work. For inspections, the entry needs to state the type of inspection, the total time and service of the aircraft, and include that signature, certificate number, and type. Accuracy and completeness here are paramount.
Okay, that covers the how of maintenance under Part 43. Now let's link it to the operational side with Part 91, general operating and flight rules. Even though it's aimed at pilots, it dictates the context for maintenance. Starting with Section 91.403, who's actually responsible?
This is maybe the most fundamental link between maintenance and operations. Section 91.403 states crystal clear that the owner or operator of the aircraft is primarily responsible for maintaining that aircraft in an airworthy condition.
Not the mechanic.
The mechanic performs the work and certifies it was done correctly according to standards, but the ultimate legal responsibility for ensuring the aircraft is airworthy, including complying with ADs and required inspections, rests with the owner or operator.
And 91.403 directly points back to Part 43.
It does. It explicitly says all maintenance, preventive maintenance, and alterations must be performed in accordance with Part 43. It connects the owner's responsibility directly to the mechanic's rulebook. If the owner flies an aircraft that's overdue for an annual inspection, they're violating 91.403.
What about after maintenance is done? Sometimes a test flight is needed. Section 91.407 covers this.
Right. If any maintenance, whether it's preventive, repair, rebuilding, or alteration, could have appreciably changed the aircraft's flight characteristics or substantially affected its operation in flight, a specific procedure is required.
What's that?
An appropriately rated pilot must fly the aircraft, perform an operational check of the maintenance performed, and log the results of that flight check in the maintenance records before that aircraft can carry passengers.
So if you adjust the flight control rigging or install the new engine.
You'd almost certainly need that operational flight check. It's a safety verification step to make sure the maintenance didn't introduce any unintended handling issues or system problems before passengers are potentially put at risk.
Makes sense. Now, the big one in Part 91 for maintenance scheduling, Section 91.409 inspections. This lays out the annual and 100-hour requirements.
This is the heartbeat of recurrent maintenance for most general aviation aircraft. The two main inspections here are the annual and the 100-hour.
What's the most important thing to understand about how they compare?
The absolute key takeaway is that the scope and detail required for an annual inspection and a 100-hour inspection are exactly the same. Both must cover all the items listed in the checklist found in Part 43, Appendix D. One is not more thorough than the other in terms of what needs to be looked at.
Same checklist, same level of detail, so what is the difference?
The differences are in when they're required and who can perform them. The annual inspection is required once every 12 calendar months for nearly all certified aircraft. And it can only be performed and approved for return to service by an AMP mechanic holding an inspection authorization, IA, or by a certificated Part 145 repair station.
12 calendar months requires an IA. What about the 100-hour?
The 100-hour inspection is required only if the aircraft is being operated for hire. The most common example is flight instruction provided for hire. If you're just flying your own plane personally, you don't need 100-hour inspections, just the annual.
And who can do the 100-hour?
Any appropriately rated AMP mechanic can perform and sign off a 100-hour inspection. They do not need an IA for this.
So, same inspection scope, different interval trigger for hire, and different authorization requirement, AMP versus IA.
You got it. That's the core distinction.
Is there any flexibility on the 100-hour limit? What if you hit 100 hours away from your maintenance base?
Yes, 91.409 allows a little wiggle room specifically for the 100-hour inspection. You can exceed the 100-hour limit by a maximum of 10 hours, but only while en route to a place where the inspection can be done.
Just for the ferry flight to maintenance?
Exactly. And here's the catch. That extra time you flew, say 5 hours of the 100, must be subtracted from the time available until the next 100-hour inspection is due. So the next inspection will be due in 95 hours, not 100. You have to pay back that time.
It's a loan, not a gift.
Good way to put it.
Now, instead of doing a big annual or 100-hour inspection all at once, owners can opt for a progressive inspection program, right? How does that work?
A progressive inspection program allows the owner to break down the required annual 100-hour inspection scope into smaller segments or phases that are performed at shorter, regular intervals. It requires specific FAA approval from the local FSDO.
Why would someone choose this?
It's often used by operators who need high aircraft utilization, like flight schools or charter operators. It minimizes downtime because you're doing smaller inspections more frequently rather than grounding the plane for a week or two for one massive inspection.
What does the owner need to submit to the FSDO to get a progressive program approved?
They need to provide a detailed plan. This includes the complete inspection schedule showing how all the required Appendix D items will be covered within each 12-month cycle, procedures for the inspections, identification of who is authorized to perform them, and importantly, definitions for the different types of inspections used in their program.
And progressive programs often introduce specific terms like routine and detailed inspections.
Yes, those terms are often part of an approved progressive program. A routine inspection usually involves checks that can be done without extensive disassembly visual checks, fluid levels, tire pressures, checking security of things you can easily see or access.
Like a thorough pre-flight or post-flight check?
We're a bit more involved than that, typically,
Yep.
but yeah, focused on readily accessible items. A detailed inspection, on the other hand, requires much more thorough examination. It involves disassemblies necessary, removing inspection panels, cleaning, and using specialized tools or techniques to inspect areas that aren't normally visible. Overhauling components might also fall under a detailed inspection phase.
So the progressive program needs to ensure that over the course of the cycle, usually 12 months, all items get the appropriate level of routine or detailed inspection required by Appendix D.
Precisely. It needs to be equivalent in scope to an annual 100-hour, just spread out over time. Okay. Beyond the main inspection cycles, there are a couple of specific system tests required every 24 months for IFR flight. Let's talk about the 411 test.
Ah, yes. The Altimeter System Test required by 14 CFR 91.411. This has to be done every 24 calendar months if you plan to operate under Instrument Flight Rules, IFR, in controlled airspace.
What exactly does it test?
It tests the entire static pressure system, the plumbing, basically plus the accuracy of the altimeter itself, and the automatic pressure altitude reporting equipment, like Mode C on the transponder. The specific procedures are laid out in Part 43, Appendix E.
Now, who can actually perform this 411 test? There seems to be some confusion here sometimes.
There often is. This is a critical point. Only the aircraft manufacturer or a properly rated Part 145 certified repair station with an instrument rating can perform the full test and calibration required for the altimeter and the altitude reporting equipment according to Appendix E.
So a regular A&P mechanic cannot certify the entire 411 test? Correct. A certificated airframe mechanic is authorized to inspect and test the static system itself, checking for leaks in the lines, inspecting the static ports. But they are not authorized to perform the calibration and certification of the altimeter instrument or the altitude encoder. That requires specialized equipment and ratings found only at repair stations or the manufacturer.
That's a very important limitation to understand. What's the other 24-month test?
That's the ATC transponder test, required by 14 CFR 91.413, often called the 413 test. Also required every 24 calendar months for any aircraft equipped with a transponder, especially if flying in airspace where it's required.
And what does this test involve?
It's a functional test of the transponder's performance according to the procedures in Part 43, Appendix F. It checks things like reply frequency, power output, receiver sensitivity, side lobe suppression, basically ensuring it's talking to ATC correctly.
And who performs the 413 test? Similar restrictions.
Yes. Again, this requires specialized test equipment. It's typically performed by a properly rated Part 145 repair station, usually with an avionics or radio rating, or sometimes by air carriers under their approved maintenance programs. Not something a typical A&P mechanic without specialized equipment and authorization can sign off.
So both the 411 and 413 tests, needed every 24 months for IFR, generally require a trip to a specialized repair station.
For most general aviation aircraft, yes, that's the practical reality.
Okay, we know what maintenance and inspections need doing. Now let's talk about proving it was done. Section 5, the documentation trail. This is governed by 14 CFR 91.417 maintenance records. This is where liability really comes home to roost, isn't it?
Absolutely. The logbooks are the legal history of the aircraft. Section 91.417 divides these records into two main types, temporary and permanent.
Let's start with temporary records. What do they cover and how long must they be kept?
Temporary records document things like maintenance, preventive maintenance, alterations, and the results of inspections, like the 100-hour or annual. The rule says that these records must be kept by the owner-operator for 1 year after the work was done, or are until that work is repeated or superseded by other work, whichever occurs later.
So the log entry for replacing a tire needs to be kept for a year, or until that tire is replaced again. The entry for a 100-hour inspection stays until the next 100-hour is done or 1 year passes.
Exactly. And remember, these entries must contain that crucial information: description of work, date, signature, certificate number, and type of certificate of the person approving the return to service. Accountability is built in.
Okay, that's temporary. What about permanent records?
Permanent records are the ones that must stay with the aircraft for its entire life, and they must be transferred to the new owner if the aircraft is sold. These are the foundational historical documents.
What's included in permanent records?
Several key items: the total time in service for the airframe and for each engine, propeller, and rotor. The current status of all life-limited parts, like turbine discs with cycle limits. The time since last overhaul for any items that require overhaul on a specific time basis. The current inspection status of the aircraft, when the next inspections are due. The current status of compliance with all applicable airworthiness directives, ADs, this is critical. And, importantly, copies of any FAA Form 337s documenting major repairs and alterations.
That AD status record is vital. How is that typically maintained?
Usually as a running list, often kept in the back of the logbook or as a separate document. It needs to list every AD applicable to that specific airframe, engine, prop, or appliance. For each AD, it must show the method of compliance. For example, inspection, part replacement, termination, the date and time in service when it was complied with, and if it's a recurring AD, when the next compliance is due. Keeping this accurate is a huge responsibility.
Now, a common question for new mechanics. Do all these maintenance records, temporary and permanent, have to be physically carried on the aircraft?
That's a very common misconception. The general answer under 91.417 is no. The maintenance records do not need to be carried on the aircraft. The owner can keep them safely stored in an office, at home, wherever is appropriate. In fact, keeping the originals off the plane is often safer.
But there's one specific exception.
Yes, there's one important, often tested exception. If the aircraft has extended range fuel tanks installed in the passenger cabin or baggage compartment, the FAA Form 337 that approve that specific installation must be carried on board the aircraft at all times. That specific 337 becomes required onboard equipment.
Only for those specific internal fuel tank mods. Good to know. Let's touch on some key forms and approvals themselves. The airworthiness certificate is fundamental.
Every registered U.S. civil aircraft needs one displayed. There are two main types. The standard airworthiness certificate, FAA Form 8100-2, is the most common. It's issued for aircraft fully certified in categories like normal, utility, acrobatic, transport, commuter. It signifies full compliance with the type design.
And the other type?
The Special Airworthiness Certificate, FAA Form 8137. This is issued for aircraft in categories that have operational limitations or don't meet all standard requirements, like restricted category, ex-military agricultural, limited category, experimental, including home builds and R&D, or light sport aircraft, LSA.
And where must this certificate be displayed?
Part 91.203 requires it to be displayed at the cabin or cockpit entrance so it's legible to passengers or crew, usually in a clear plastic holder near the door.
We've talked about FAA Form 337 for major repairs and alterations. How does the physical form get handled after the work is signed off?
The 337 is completed in duplicate, two identical copies. One copy goes to the owner-operator. It becomes part of the aircraft's permanent records, staying with the logbooks.
And the second copy?
The second copy must be sent by the mechanic or agency that performed the work to the FAA Aircraft Registration Branch in Oklahoma City within 48 hours of approving the aircraft for return to service. This ensures the FAA maintains a central record of major changes made to the aircraft's configuration over its life.
Okay. Supplemental Types Certificates, STCs. We know they approve modifications. What's a critical point for mechanics to understand about using an STC?
This trips people up constantly. An STC is essentially design approval documentation owned by the STC holder, a company or individual. Just finding a copy of the STC paperwork does not automatically give you the legal right to use that design data to modify an aircraft.
So possessing the paper isn't enough?
Not at all. You, the mechanic or owner, must obtain permission from the STC holder to use their approved data. This usually involves purchasing the STC package, which includes the actual certificate, installation instructions, often including the ICA, and importantly, a letter granting you permission to alter a specific aircraft by serial number using that STC data.
So if you install an STC mod without getting that permission?
You haven't used approved data correctly under Part 43, even if you follow the instructions perfectly. The installation is technically illegal and the aircraft potentially unairworthy. You need the permission letter.
That's a crucial detail. Now, the document that defines the aircraft's original approved identity, the Type Certificate Data Sheet, TCDS.
The TCDS is foundational. Officially, under Part 21.41, it's considered part of the aircraft's type certificate. Think of the TC as the main approval document. The TCDS is a detailed specification sheet attached to it.
What kind of information is on the TCDS?
It lists all the essential specifications and limitations under which the aircraft met its original airworthiness requirements. Things like the specific engine and propeller models approved, required fuel grade, airspeed limitations, VEAN, VSO, etc., weight and center of gravity limits, control surface travel limits, required equipment list, if any, required placards, minimum crew, maximum passenger seats, maybe even noise limits.
So it's the aircraft's official burst specs and operating limit.
Exactly. Conforming to type design means meeting everything specified on that TCDS, plus any alterations approved via STC or 337. If you operate the aircraft outside a TCDS limitation, you're potentially violating its airworthiness. They first came out around 1958, formalizing the data from the older cars.
Beyond mandatory regulations and forms, the FAA provides a lot of guidance material. Let's talk about advisory circulars, ACs. Are they legally binding?
No, ACs are explicitly non-regulatory. They don't make law. What they do is provide guidance, methods, techniques, and practices that the FAA finds acceptable for complying with the actual regulations.
So they show you one way, an FAA-accepted way, to meet a rule.
Precisely. The most famous example for mechanics is the AC 43.13 series, like 43.13 in NACDETS 1B and NACDETS 2B we mentioned earlier. It's full of acceptable repair techniques for non-pressurized aircraft under 12,500 pounds. You can use other methods if you can prove they meet the regulation, but following the guidance in an applicable AC is generally a safe harbor, showing you used an FAA-accepted practice.
And there's a logic to the AC numbering system.
Yes, it's quite organized. The number before the dash usually corresponds to the related 14 CFR part. So an AC starting with 25 relates to part 25, transport category airplanes. An AC starting with 43 relates to part 43, maintenance. The number after the dash is just sequential within that subject area, and a letter at the end, ABC, indicates the revision level.
So AC 43.13-1B is the second revision, Rev B, of the 13th AC issued relating to Part 43. Helps you find relevant and current guidance.
Exactly. It's a helpful system once you understand the key.
Okay, before we wrap up the regulatory overview, we need to touch on a somewhat different area. Light sport aircraft, LSA. Their maintenance rules operate under a different philosophy, don't they?
They really do. It's a major departure from the traditional FAA certification and maintenance system we've been discussing. The key difference is that LSA design, production, and maintenance rely primarily on industry consensus standards, specifically those developed by ASTM International, American Society for Testing and Materials, rather than directly on FAA regulations like Part 23 or Part 43 in the traditional sense.
ASTM standards, not FARs, are the benchmark.
For the most part, yes. The FAA accepts these ASTM standards as the means of compliance for LSA.
Right.
So when maintaining an LSA, the mechanic needs to refer to the applicable ASTM standards cited by the manufacturer, not necessarily AC 43.013 or other traditional FAA data.
How does this affect documentation for major repairs or alterations on an LSA? Is Form 337 required?
No, FAA Form 337 is generally not used for major repairs or alterations on LSA. Instead, the maintenance documentation, like the logbook entry, must include a statement attesting that the work was performed in accordance with the applicable ASTM standards and that the aircraft is still in a condition for safe operation. The entry needs to cite the specific ASTM standard used.
So compliance is measured against ASTM, not directly against FAA regs, and documented differently. What about safety issues? If the FAA isn't issuing ADs for LSAs, how are fleet-wide problems addressed?
For certified LSAs, Special LSA or SLSA, safety issues are typically handled through safety directives or mandatory service bulletins issued by the manufacturer, not the FAA. Compliance with these manufacturer directives is generally mandatory for SLSA owners-operators.
So the manufacturer takes on a role similar to the FAA regarding mandatory actions.
In that specific context for SLSA safety issues, yes. The exception is for experimental LSAs, ELSA, where compliance might not be mandatory unless required for continued flight authorization.
And the mechanic certification for LSA is different too.
It is. Part 65 created specific LSA repairman certificates. There's the LSA Repairman Inspection Rating, which only allows the holder, usually the owner, to perform the required annual condition inspection on their own specific ELSA after taking a short course.
Just inspection, just their own plane.
Right. Then there's the LSA Repairman Maintenance Rating. This requires much more extensive training, often around 120 hours for a specific class like airplane, weight shift, etc. This rating allows the holder to perform maintenance and the annual condition inspection on SLSAs and ELSAs of the appropriate class. An A&P mechanic can also work on LSAs, but they still need to follow the manufacturer's maintenance procedures and ASTM standards.
So a whole different ecosystem for LSA maintenance based on industry standards.
It's definitely a different approach important for mechanics to be aware of as LSAs become more common.
Wow, okay. That's a whirlwind tour through the core regulations and documents. Let's try to pull the main threads together for the AMT student listening. What's the big picture takeaway?
I think the core mission here is to see the connections. Every time you touch an aircraft as a mechanic, your actions are governed by this interplay, primarily between Part 21, defining what the aircraft should be, the type design, the approved parts, Part 43, defining how you legally work on it, the procedures, the data, the sign-offs, and Part 91, defining the operational context and the owner's ultimate responsibility for airworthiness, which includes ensuring Part 43 work is done.
And the mechanic stands as the gatekeeper for those two pillars of airworthiness we started with.
Exactly. Your job, your signature, affirms both. Conformity to type design, it matches the approved blueprint, Part 21 data, and condition for safe operation. It's physically safe to fly now, Part 43 standards met. You're reconciling the history, design, with the present condition, according to the rules, 43 and 91.
That logbook entry isn't just closing out a job, it's a legal declaration with real weight.
It carries significant liability and historical importance. It says, based on my training and certification, I has verified this aircraft meets the required standards.
Okay, let's wrap up with a final thought. We spent a good bit of time on Part 91.417, maintenance records, both temporary and permanent. We know these records, especially the permanent ones tracing back to the TCDS and original certification basis, are absolutely essential for determining conformity.
They are the bedrock of proving conformity over time.
Now, many aircraft still flying today were certified decades ago under the old civil air regulations, say R3 or CAR 4A. Their TCDSs, which formalized those standards around 1958, are still their legal certification basis. Think about a classic Cessna 140, a Piper Cub, planes from the 40s and 50s.
Absolutely. Their airworthiness is still judged against those very old standards, unless modified by ADs or STCs.
So here's the thought. Given this deep reliance on historical documentation, sometimes stretching back over 50, 60, 70 years, including TCDSs based on potentially superseded SARs, what are the real long-term ethical responsibilities of an AMT today when determining conformity to type design on these legacy aircraft, especially when the original manufacturer might be long gone or specific data becomes incredibly scarce? What does conformity truly mean when the regulatory and support landscape has shifted so much over decades?
That's a fantastic and challenging question. It means the AMT working on these older aircraft has to be more than just a mechanic. They have to be something of a historian and a detective. The ethical responsibility is profound. It means diligently researching and applying the standards that were in effect at the time of certification, unless specifically overwritten by an AD. It means understanding that the TCDS is the legal baseline. When data is scarce, it means responsibly seeking out equivalent, acceptable, or approved data, maybe from vintage ACs, type clubs, or pursuing field approvals, and meticulously documenting the basis for conformity. It means never assuming something is okay just because it's old. Your signature on that logbook entry isn't just for today. It's validating that entire chain of historical conformity, potentially based on documents older than you are, for the next owner, the next mechanic, and ultimately for the safety of flight. It's about maintaining the integrity of that historical thread, even when it gets frayed or hard to follow.